The assassination of President John Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963, remains one of the most compelling murder mysteries of the century. The man officially held accountable was, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald. It seemed that throughout his 24-year life, Lee Harvey Oswald desperately wanted to be somebody important, to change the world somehow, to teach it a lesson. On November 22nd, 1963, the world did change, and Oswald was at the center of it all.
President Kennedy and Governor John Conley of Texas were shot in an assassination attempt in downtown Dallas.
Just a moment. We have a bulletin coming in. We now switch you directly to Parkland Hospital.
It's official. As of just a few moments ago, the President of the United States is dead.
Just 45 minutes after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, a Dallas police officer who was on the lookout for the killer was himself shot and killed. Arrested for that murder just moments later, a 24-year-old ex-Marine, Lee Harvey Oswald. The cops who arrested Oswald brought him downtown to the police station, which was mobbed by reporters desperate for information on the death of the president.
Has the gentleman been identified?
Yes, sir. He's been identified for killing the officer.
Right. Has any identification been attempted for the killing of the president?
Not yet.
Not yet.
But it quickly became apparent that the thin, brown-haired Oswald matched an eyewitness description of a man who had fled a building overlooking Dealey Plaza shortly after the fatal shots were fired.
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man!
Come on, man. The president? No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I live in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
President?
Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans on October 18th, 1939, just 2 months after his father, an insurance salesman, had died of a heart attack. Lee's mother, Marguerite, quickly discovered that caring for her 3 boys, John from her first marriage, Robert Jr., and the newborn Lee, was more than she could handle.
She was constantly complaining about not having enough money, not enough food in the house, we were a burden. It was obvious we were a burden. And we felt, this is why she was always shipping us off to someplace, you know. And we understood it. She was having a hard time, but, you know, we wanted to be there. We wanted to be a family type thing. It was natural, but it wasn't to be.
In 1942, the 3-year-old Lee and his brothers were placed in an orphanage where they lived with 100 other children. Lee slept in a bed next to Robert, who made sure that no one picked on his baby brother. A year later, Lee's mother met an electrical engineer named Edwin Ekdahl. They took the boys out of the orphanage, married, and moved into a large house in Dallas. Lee got along with his new stepfather, who took him on business trips and bought him toys, and for the first time, Lee had someone who put a measure of stability into his life. But the stability was fleeting. Lee's mother and stepfather argued frequently and separated numerous times. In 1948, after 3 years of marriage, they divorced.
Things just started going downhill again, type thing, from the economical standpoint. We ended up at a small house in Benbrook, Texas, and that's where Lee started the first grade.
Most of the kids in our neighborhood were into football, you know, being 10 years old, so we were into football and baseball and sneaking off hoping we didn't get caught. Lee was not excluded by the kids in the neighborhood, but he didn't really offer to participate too much.
With the family's arrival in Benbrook, Texas, the young Lee Harvey had already moved 8 times in 6 years. He was constantly adjusting to new surroundings, new faces.
He changed schools so frequently that even if he had had the nature, which he really didn't, to form friends and to settle into somebody close, he never had that opportunity.
It certainly did not help matters that his mother was overbearing to an extreme, controlling Lee and smothering him.
They slept in the same bed till Lee was about 11 years old. He's a lonely boy, extraordinarily lonely, read all the time. And she filled his ego with the idea that he was extraordinarily important. She was impressed with everything he did. She was the kind of mother who was, if he opened his mouth and said something, she'd say, "You're so brilliant. You're wonderful. You're going to be something extraordinary." On the other hand, she was very tough to deal with, so by the time he grew up, he really half hated her.
And I think it just had a devastating effect on Lee. His exposure, and without exception, she had to be the most significant person in his life. He couldn't get away from her fast enough.
Lee rebelled by being demanding, aggressive, hard to control, at times violent. In 1952, when Lee was 12, he and his mother journeyed north to New York City, where Lee's half-brother John was now stationed in the Coast Guard.
They're just there, quote, for a short visit, but it becomes a longer stay, okay? And there's friction between John and mother, John's wife and Lee, okay? They have a big argument about something about Lee was threatening her with a knife and everything. So John says, "Okay, that does it. You got to go."
So mother and child moved away from the family to a one-room basement apartment in the Bronx. In school, the other kids teased Lee because of his shabby clothes and his southern accent. So Lee stopped going to school.
He was missing like 4 out of 5 days out of the week, and it went over to about 100 and some odd days of the school term that he had missed.
He played hooky so frequently that for 3 weeks in 1953, he was placed in a home for juvenile delinquents and required to undergo psychiatric evaluation. Counselors found the 14-year-old Lee to be withdrawn and emotionally disturbed.
He had no friends. He spent most of his time by himself. He told me, I remember his saying to me, that there was kind of a veil between him and other people, and he liked it like that. He didn't want anybody to pull aside the veil.
Lee's sense of isolation only intensified as he grew older, aggravated by his mother's obsession with his sexuality. She gave him no privacy and made Lee feel insecure about his body by voicing her concern that Lee had some kind of sexual problem, even though doctors saw no evidence of one.
She said, "Well, had they looked down there?" And I said, you know, I assume so. I don't know. There was nothing that they found that was, you know, at all remarkable. She also told me she used to bathe all her kids herself until they were about 10 or 11, and then they got too big down there for her to look at.
To get away from his mother, Lee wandered the streets of New York, memorizing the subway system and visiting the Bronx Zoo, a young boy all alone in the big city, susceptible to whatever influences came along, including political ones.
Young Lee Harvey Oswald, with no association and nothing to latch onto in life, gets a pamphlet one day from a woman on a street corner of New York, and it turns out to be about the Rosenberg case, people charged for selling state secrets on the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. And suddenly he reads it, and he latches onto something in this sort of life that's looking for a purpose and aim, and it happens to be a political philosophy, and it's communism.
He read the Communist Manifesto when he was about 15, and already I think there's this style implicit in him that he was going to find a separate solution for everything in his life.
His mother's solution to his truancy problems was to pick up and move back to New Orleans, and soon after to Fort Worth, Texas. Despite his communist leanings, Lee decided he wanted to follow in the footsteps of his older brother Robert and enlist in the Marines.
He admired somebody, and that was Robert Oswald. He looked up to his brother, and his brother had escaped the oppression of that household by going to the Marine Corps, and that was Lee's ticket to freedom.
In October 1956, when he turned 17, Lee Harvey Oswald signed up immediately. It was the opportunity he had longed for, a chance to escape from his mother, and his first step toward finding that separate solution for his life. A quest that would eventually lead Oswald to a place few Americans ventured during the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union. In the fall of 1956, Lee Harvey Oswald was so eager to escape from his oppressive mother and start life on his own that he rushed off to Marine boot camp just 1 week after his 17th birthday. At the recruit depot in San Diego, Oswald shared a Quonset hut with Michael Toby, but made no effort to be friendly.
Living that close together for 3 months, you got to know a little story about everybody, except him. I mean, he was just there. He didn't get in trouble. He wasn't outstanding. He didn't necessarily have a pack of guys that he was friendly with. He didn't sit around and shoot the breeze with us.
After qualifying on the firing range as a sharpshooter and training in aircraft surveillance and radar, Oswald shipped out to the Atsugi Air Base outside Tokyo. He quickly managed to alienate his superiors by trying to prove at every turn that he was smarter and better informed than they were about public affairs.
He started asking them foreign policy questions, like, what do you think of Mossadegh in Afghanistan, or wherever Mossadegh was, and they wouldn't know what he was talking about. And then he turned to his commanding officer afterward and say, why is it that they're officers and I'm not, and I know more about foreign policy than they do? And of course his commanding officer would say to him in effect, well, man, what we're doing here is radar. And foreign policy doesn't enter it over here. We're just working these radar machines.
Quickly, this career that he hopes will take off doesn't take off at all. As a matter of fact, he's court-martialed once for shooting himself with a pistol that he's not supposed to have. Another time he attacks a senior officer and gets into a fight.
In June 1958, Lee was sentenced to 28 days in military prison. It made him bitter.
He hated the brig. He hated the Marine Corps. He felt they'd oppressed him, that they denied him, that they didn't appreciate him. The key thing was that they didn't have an understanding of how brilliant he was.
Disgusted with the Marines, but still searching for some way to distinguish himself, Lee turned once again to communism. His interest in the Soviet Union intensified. He began to study Russian. Fellow Marines called him Oswaldskovich.
He had Russian records. He would play chess with people and ask for the red pieces or checkers. He would answer "ya" if you asked him a question about something. And people viewed him not as a security threat, not as somebody who was a Russian spy, but just sort of as a quirky person who was to be avoided. He was almost a joke at this point.
By 1959, Oswald was such a failure as a Marine that he was reduced to janitorial work. He began maneuvering to get out of the service. Lee's mother, back in Texas, anxious to get him home, came up with a flimsy excuse.
Mother had an accident at the place that she was working and applied to get him out on early discharge on the premise that he would come home and help her support herself. And that procedure went through, so consequently he was discharged in early September of '59.
But life with his domineering mother was not what Lee had in mind. Just 2 days after arriving in Fort Worth, he headed off for New Orleans, then purchased a one-way boat ticket for passage to Europe. Lee wrote his mother a quick goodbye letter telling her he did not expect her to understand his plans.
Mother has a letter from him saying that, he's going to go to Russia.